Hello and good morning. My name is Tony Runcie and I will be your presenter today. Our presentation is supposed to start at 10, which is right now, but I'd like to give just a few minutes for people to continue to join. We have a certain number of people we're expecting that were registered for today, and so the number I'm just going to watch to make sure we're getting pretty close to, and then we will launch. So I am going to start. If you have any questions and you're familiar with Zoom, please do not hesitate to use either the chat function or the Q&A. The chat function will come to me. I can answer the questions in real time. The Q&A goes out so other people can see it as well. So it's up to you for your comfort level. Today's presentation will be recorded. So at the end, we will be able to send out a link with the presentation recording to everybody who attended so that you will have access to view this later on, reference back to it, and to be able to utilize it for other resources. Our magical disclaimer: this presentation is meant to provide general information regarding the subject that we're going over today, documentation do's and don'ts. We may provide some kind of advice throughout the presentation. It is not legal advice. Every situation should be managed individually. We can definitely absolutely have conversations about that in the chat function, or after the fact when you receive the email recording, you'll be able to respond an email to me and I can answer other questions after the fact. But the webinar is intended for educational purposes only to help you. So if we do give Q&A answers, please remember they're not legal advice. Who are we? BlueLion is a human resource consulting company. We are located in New England. This is our fantastic team. Our team has actually grown exponentially from this photo. Excuse me, we have 3 more amazing team members that we now work with. We are all located in the New England area, except one employee who's in North Carolina. We support small businesses to medium-sized businesses with their HR outsourced needs. We make sure we fit exactly what you're looking for. And if we don't, we try and help you find another HR person who can. We really specialize in a lot of blue-collar companies that we do business with. We are real people with real personalities. If you ever meet us, you'll definitely recognize that. You'll probably get a little bit today during my presentation. We are also a 1% pledge company. So we pledge 1% of our profit, our services, and our time back to the communities in which we do business and live in. And we're not salespeople. None of the people you see in that photo are salespeople, really, except for Allison, who is one of our co-owners. She's the only one who likes to network and have those sales meetings. Everyone else in there is an HR consultant or a marketing person whose job is strictly to just help you get the answers you're looking for. My name is Tony. I will be your presenter today. I am a co-founder and co-owner of BlueLion. I have over 14 years of HR experience. I have experience in a lot of different backgrounds, different industries, different kinds of focuses, benefits, payroll, employee relations, legal, all sorts of things when you've been doing this for 14 years. I'm both certified by the Society of Human Resource Management and the Human Resource Certification, and have my master's from Southern New Hampshire University. And a lot longer hair than in that photo. So what are we here for today? Today, our overview is that documentation, whether you're the HR person, you have an HR title, whether you're the owner, whether you're a manager, whether you are the business consultant, whoever you may be, is one of the most important activities that you manage when it comes to employee performance, company protection, and reducing potential liability and risk. By communicating and doing proper documentation is the difference between lawsuit wins and losses. I always tell people, and I'll go through it today, that just because you've documented something, or because, for example, we're in New Hampshire and we're employment at will, that does not necessarily mean that when you let somebody go and you don't tell them why, that they couldn't turn around and have a Department of Labor dispute or a lawsuit against you for wrongful termination. Employment at will absolutely means that either person can come and go as they wish for no reason at all. But without the right documentation, if you're letting somebody go, you're opening yourself up for potential liability, that it becomes a quote unquote he said, she said, or he said situation where you think in your mind we let you go because of performance, they think in their mind, maybe you let them go because of some kind of a discriminatory factor. Today, we're really going to drill down into how we document this information more thoroughly, more accurately, and making sure that if something ever had to go to a legal situation during discovery, you have the best chance, if we're doing it correctly and not being biased or discriminatory in nature, to win those lawsuits. Or if you're lucky enough that the other side, when they see your documentation, doesn't even take the situation further to court. So our agenda today is best practices for HR documentation. Those are our do's. Why documenting issues and performance are important. What you should not document and put in writing. That's our don'ts. And who can have access to these documents after the fact. So that's another important piece of the pie, is who can see these documents when I make performance things. I'll generally be referencing the New England states when I talk about the different kinds of laws on this presentation today. Most common New Hampshire and Massachusetts, for example. But if you have other states with other questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. Okay, so when a manager says they have performance documents, you start to cringe a little bit. I have seen things that make me very worried, scratch my head, wonder why they felt that that's something that they should put into writing. And it's concerning because once it's written down, it might as well be set in stone. It becomes part of a performance document, a personnel file, and it can become discoverable by legal. A lot of people think to themselves, if they don't give an employee a specific document like a written warning or a performance improvement plan or a corrective action document, that their performance isn't necessarily as thoroughly documented. Email communication and other kinds of forms of communication can be considered performance management in the eyes of the law. So that means that if for some reason you terminated somebody, they felt that it was discriminatory in nature, then something happens, an attorney could subpoena all of your emails that you've had back and forth with that employee. So I try and tell people, be very conscientious of the things you're putting in your emails. Your emails are company owned. Tell your employees their company owned emails, remind your managers their company owned emails, and that the things that they document in those emails are discoverable legally if something were to happen and the company were to have a lawsuit against them for a wrongful termination or discrimination or something like that. These are important kinds of trainings as well that you can take back to your management staff and train them so they know what they should and should not be documenting when it comes to an employee. So here's some document do's, and we'll go into each one in depth. Do establish clear performance expectations. Do focus on facts. Do review what the pattern of a behavior may be. Write down specific plans and follow up. So we're going to talk about what each one of these really means, how we do it, and why we do it. So we do establish clear performance expectations. We want to outline those expectations of what the company has for an employee. That may look like a job description, that may look like an offer letter. Maybe it is our employee handbooks if we have them. Documented policies and procedures, all of the things that really outline how we expect the employee to engage with the company and how the employee can expect the company to engage with them. By outlining those expectations, it really removes all of the ambiguity that an employee may have of what their job is. Sometimes I get the question of, I've given an employee a job description, but over time, there's been additional things added, or based off of a restructuring, a merger and acquisition, maybe a reduction in workforce, some of those things have to change. Can I change that information? The answer is yes. There's absolutely times that when a company has to make decisions based on business needs, an employee's position that they currently may know may shift. And there's additional things, or some things shift to somebody else and new things shift to them on their task plate. Sometimes there's financial gain or loss that goes with that. Sometimes there is not. But by documenting it and outlining the new expectations, you're letting the employee know, here's where we're going to be at moving forward. By keeping open lines of communication and writing things down, it really reduces the potential misunderstanding or miscommunication between the employee and you, the employer. And communication is the biggest thing that creates the breakdown between those two groups. So we definitely like to have things in writing. I know sometimes that annoys people. Just one more thing on your plate or on your task list to follow up on. So we'll talk a little bit about how to try and reduce the pain or the hassle of that. But outlining that is really great. If you're the kind of organization that does performance appraisals, for example, maybe you do them quarterly, every 6 months, or annually, whatever it may be. I always like during a new employee onboarding to provide them with the performance review that's going to come up for them in whatever the timeline may be. It's a blank review, but it lets them know, here are the 6, 3, 10, I've seen all different sizes, concepts or things that we will be evaluating you on in the next X number of days, months, or in a year. That lets the employee know, okay, here's what they're looking for me to do. Not just my job description, but also, all right, here's the additional quantifiers or metrics that they're measuring against me to see if I'm doing my job well. So that's a very clear outline of what is being expected. Because of that, you'll be able to document if things are not getting met. So that's why it's nice to have things written down versus just verbally giving information to somebody. It can be as easy as an email that has bullet points in it, printing it and putting it in their file. Or I have some employers who are like, oh, if I had to print every single time I sent somebody an email, that would be a real hassle for me. I try and say, okay, well then instead you can have kind of an electronic file on your inbox, put their name and drop the emails in there. And then maybe monthly, I'll ask you to print them all out for me versus you having to do it every single time. Or I can work with IT to get that information from you so you don't have to worry about it. Again, you want that documentation that exists. By giving those expectations and the documentation, there is a very clear outline of what is and is not going to be met as being good or, I hate to say it, bad performance. Do focus on the facts. Sometimes we're quick to jump when somebody brings something to our attention and we don't necessarily have the full scope or picture of what's occurring. So gather all the relevant facts before you make that decision, especially if you're going to have the decision be a disciplinary one that is a written warning or a performance improvement plan or a potential termination or suspension, things like that. Don't just take necessarily one individual's piece of information. Do your own due diligence, call the employee in, ask the employee questions, do a small mini investigation, because oftentimes I've found early in my career, when I jumped to a conclusion based off of one piece of information, when the whole picture came together, I realized that there was a lot of miscommunication and more than one person really was holding the strings of the bag of issues. Take the time to find out why the conduct and performance aren't being met. So that's a little bit harder to do. There's a little bit more drilling in on that. We want to ask managers if they're bringing things to our attention, how have you communicated with the employee? Have you written it down? Have you told them? Have you verbally met with them? If it's a kind of employment where you have to show them what they're doing and then watch them, so a more tactical job experience, who trained them? Was it you? Was it somebody else? Did you monitor the training? Was there quality control to make sure that their training was really done in its full scope? So paying attention to that as well. Summarize the misconduct or the policy violation. So we always want to drill back, which is why that first step existed, to what has been communicated with you. So for example, let's pretend we have an employee who has attendance issues. Well, if you have a policy that says employees need to arrive on time, if they don't, if they're late 3 or more times in a month, 10 or more minutes, then they're going to have a written performance, a written documentation. Well, if they're late and that's the policy and they don't communicate with anybody and they're not letting anybody know what's going on, and we give them a written document that that's the policy they broke, it'd be very difficult for them to say that's discriminatory in nature. Unless, of course, that there's other employees who are doing the same thing that we're not holding equally accountable. So those are one of those moments where I like to push back when an employer comes to me or when a manager comes to me and I say, is there anyone else in the department that's doing the same thing that we're not holding to the same standard? If the answer is yes, I say why. And sometimes there may be, well, because they're brand new, so they're still learning. Okay, great. Well, because of X, Y, and Z, so they have an accommodation that falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, I can do that. Well, I just haven't had a chance to get to it. Not an excuse I'm generally going to let pass by me. We need to be holding everybody to the most equal that we can and to their capabilities as possible to reduce the potential of discriminatory access at risk. A clear statement of fact focuses only on what happened, and it doesn't include speculation or unverified information. It also is not emotional in nature. So we want to make sure that when we're documenting things, it is very short, sweet, to the point, focused on facts, focused on policy, less about emotional results or emotional outcomes. So we'll talk a little bit about that in another section here about how we're managing or how we manage behavior issues, because those are a little bit harder for us to manage because it is a little bit more perception based. But when we're drilling down, I'll explain exactly what that would look like if we're trying to focus on the facts at hand. Because facts are what legal cares about. I do my little memes in here. Facts are what legal companies care about. Facts are more important than anything else. It's the who, what, when, where. We'll go into why we're not going to focus on the why. That's the only thing that we do not want to document because it's very important that we don't try and decide that, turn ourselves into attorneys, judge and jury, because once we write some of that stuff down, it could potentially put us again at risk. But when we're documenting things, issues, we definitely document, who was involved, what happened exactly, when did it happen? Was it yesterday? Where was it on company site? Sometimes we have performance issues off sites. And then we dig into each one of those particular things. So here we are with the behavior patterns, right? So this is what I was talking about earlier. So do review the pattern or problem of behavior. So is this the first time something has happened? When we, for example, BlueLion drafts a performance policy inside of a handbook and we draft out really kind of a disciplinary action process, it usually escalates depending on the situation or how many times we need to communicate with them. So the first one is, what is the issue? Are we at the level of a verbal warning? Are we at the level of a written warning? Have we already given a verbal warning? So this is a second offense. Now it's a written warning. Okay, we've given a written warning. Are we at a final warning? Is the severity of the first situation so egregious that we need to put the employee on suspension? And that's great. So we have that information and we need to do what we need to do. Or are we skipping all these steps because of the situation and the severity and we go all the way to termination? Those are usually the steps to get to where we're going. Somewhere in there, we might put somebody on a performance improvement plan if we feel like that's a good action to try and get them to where they need to be if they just need a little bit more hand-holding. So what is this in the process? Is this the first time, second time? Is it so bad on the first time we need to jump around? So instead of ignoring all the previous incidents, if you haven't necessarily addressed it, I get this all the time, you can address it here. So I have employers who reach out, or I have managers who reach out and they say, I go, is this the first time this has happened? And they'll say no. But I never talk to them about it the first time or the second time or the third time sometimes. So can I really bring that up now? The answer is yes. It's a pattern of behavior. So even though this is the specific incident we're talking about, we can reflect on previous incidents and we can document these incidents occurred on these days. However, were not previously addressed with you, except the fact that they do show pattern of behavior. You're consistently late. So maybe I forgot to document you last month for the attendance issue when you were here 10 minutes late past 3 times, but you were based on your time cards. So it did happen. I'm bringing it into this particular conversation because it seems like there's a pattern of behavior here. Just because it's your first time and maybe you were like, oh, I didn't have time to address it last time, doesn't mean that we have to pretend previous issues don't exist. If you have addressed it previously, include the steps you took at each phase of conducting the conversation. So if it was, hey, we talked at our last 30-minute get together about these metrics not being measured, and here we are 30 days later, still not being measured. 30 days ago, I told you they needed to be at XYZ. They still aren't. Now we're putting you on a performance improvement plan. We talked about it. That's what happened last time. Now this time we're doing this. We're going to shift the way we're going to work with you to try and see if this kind of plan works. Did the supervisor talk to the employee? So if you're on the call and you're a second level manager, so there's a manager under you who manages the staff or the team, and they're bringing an incident to you because they want to terminate or they want to escalate the performance-driven issues. Did they talk to the employee? Because I get so often somebody who says, oh, I have an issue with X, Y, and Z. And I go, okay, well, have you talked to them about it? And the answer is no, I thought you were going to handle that. Not a problem, but it kind of still keeps us at square one. Because if I, as the HR person, come on site, or I, as the second tier manager, go to manage this problem, and this is the first time the employee has ever heard of these concerns, it's going to be a problem. They're going to be blindsided. A lot of us think that we've communicated with people or that people should have quote unquote common sense to know things they should or should not do. I don't know about many of you, but I don't watch TV. I don't get cable. But I would say common sense is much less common than it used to be. It's more like uncommon sense at this point in time. So realistically, thinking that somebody thinks that what they're doing is right and it's not, and the manager brings it to your attention to address it when they've never addressed it, is going to be basically putting you back at square one, again, depending on the severity of the situation. Was the employee reprimanded formally or informally? That's the verbal documentation versus a written documentation. Was the employee warned or suspended? What that means is, did we set clear expectations when we communicated with them previously about what would happen next if they didn't essentially get their act together? Did we say if you don't start showing up on time, the next step is to terminate you? Or did we just say, you haven't come in for however many days per the policy, and so you need to correct your stuff or further action will occur? Well, what's further action? Are you just going to continue to write me up for the next 6 months that I'm late? Or are you going to actually terminate me? And that goes back to policy writing and actual policy management. So for example, BlueLion does do a lot of handbook documentation. We create handbooks for some of our clients. And a lot of times when I'm doing the consultation for the handbook, I'll say, are you actually going to do this? If your best employee is your latest employee every single day, are you really going to fire them at the third or fourth strike? Because if the answer is no, don't put the policy in the handbook. Don't put something that you're going to be held to the fire to just because you want it there just in case. It actually acts and counts against you in a court of law because you have a policy that you're not holding anybody accountable to except for maybe one or two people. There's the potential discriminatory action. So if you're not going to follow it, don't be afraid to not have it. I know some people think, okay, well, we'll have it quote unquote just in case. Well, if your just in case is somebody who's been working with you for 10 years and they're still doing that action, and I come to you and I say, are you ready to fire Ben or Barbara? And your answer is no, they're our highest salesperson. So even though they're a jerk or they come into work every day late or they call out every Friday, my feedback to you is don't have an attendance policy that says if you're going to call it every Friday, you're going to get fired, because that's not the case depending on performance. Do I encourage that that's the way you manage your operations? Of course not. But is it how it is, especially right now with the talent market, the way that we're trying to find people and that we can't? Yeah, I think a lot of us may be holding on to people who are not necessarily meeting those standards because we're so afraid to not be able to fill the roles with another qualified candidate. So paying attention to the policies and what we're actually doing and what we're writing and what we're monitoring. Include the pattern to show that you considered previous incidents when you took the current action. So we kind of go back to the beginning. Are we paying attention to what happened? Yes or no? Or the severity of it is, I wouldn't necessarily do a verbal warning, for example, for time fraud. That's a pretty egregious act. You're stealing from the company. That's the kind of thing that reflects the level of your integrity, your character, and realistically, if you're willing to do that, what else are you potentially willing to do that's going to harm the business? That usually gets a termination right away, or a suspension when you're doing an investigation. So that's the other thing. Suspension does not always mean the person is quote unquote guilty of the action that has occurred or has been brought to someone's attention. Sometimes we put people on a suspension. Usually I say paid, because if you're not sure the person's done something, you don't want them losing compensation while you're doing your back end investigation, while you're trying to figure certain things out. That happens a lot when it comes to potential harassment, discrimination, sexual harassment, or other kinds of deep things as fraud or theft, because you don't necessarily want the employee in the business when you're doing the investigation and the information gathering. But you also don't want to terminate until you really have all of your facts, because maybe through your investigation, you find that that's not the case. And if you had jumped to conclusions and done the first action, it could absolutely be considered a wrongful termination. Do write down a specific plan. So here's our documentation again, dues, these are dues. Include in your documentation a specific plan for the employee to follow the improvement. It doesn't need to be 10 pages long. It doesn't need to be this long, drawn out, wordy, lengthy legal document. If I'm late, the documentation is, your expectation is that you arrive on time to clock in at 8 o'clock a.m. Monday through Friday when your shift starts. It's easy as one sentence. But you're documenting very clearly, again, these are the expectations I have set for you, and I'm looking for you to meet. So that's a really important piece. List the criteria that the employee must meet and include a time frame for those. So that's if it's a little bit more in depth. So if we have, for example, an employee, let's say it's a sales employee who's not meeting their metrics for the sales department. What we might say to them is, okay, you're not meeting your sales quotas. We're not really sure why. So here's a couple of metrics we're going to put in place. You need to dial 30 people in a day, cold call, to try and set 4 appointments in a month. So that is a very potential realistic thing depending on the kind of sales that you do, because the steps and the actions I'm looking for are going to give me the result that I'm looking for, which is higher sales, which happens from setting appointments, meeting with people. But in order to do that, you need to get in front of them. And in order to do that, you need to schedule. Well, the reality of it is most people don't want to answer the phone and don't want to schedule time with you. So you have to call way more people than the people you're sitting with. So the metrics might be, you need to cold call however many people, you need to set 4 appointments, blah, 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 blah. Those are very clear and distinctive metrics driven by numbers. You can think about setting them almost like the SMART method, like very specific, measurable, attainable. Are they realistic? Are they time sensitive? So if they have to do that in a day and then you want to pull those metrics, those are things you can decide whether or not they are or are not meeting. It's not arbitrary. Well, your sales need to be $30,000 more this month. That's great. How do I get there if I'm not already there? So drilling in on what we're looking for the employee to start doing to get the results that we're expecting. The more specific the objective and the criteria, the easier it is to measure. So as I said, if they're hitting 30,000 or not, that's helpful. Maybe it isn't helpful. Well, for sales, for a specific example, sales can be very cyclical. So in the beginning of the year, you can hit $1 million, for example, for 1 month. And then the rest of the year, maybe they're just smaller $10,000 deals. Well, for the year you've hit your quota, but maybe every month you're not hitting your quota. Does that matter to you as a business? Well, the same with performance. Are there certain quotas that are being met daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually? What are they and how are we gathering those facts? Be sure that you tell and document to the employee that failure to meet this could result in additional action up to termination. So additional action is if you're giving a verbal warning, letting them know next warning could be our final warning, or depending on the situation, next warning could be termination. Sometimes, like I said, verbal warning is not where you start depending on the severity. So your first warning could be a final warning. And the next time it's termination. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. So just making sure you write that down is really, really helpful. The other thing about writing them down and putting them as clear and drafting the documentation of performance is when the employee, essentially, if you had to terminate them, ends up going to the Department of Labor or the Department of Unemployment and making a claim, by having all of the documentation you have, when the Department of Labor or the unemployment office reaches out to you for the unemployment, you can provide that information to them legally. They're government entities. And so you can say, no, we didn't fire Sarah because of whatever. We fired her because she never came to work. It helps you if you want to try and fight unemployment claims. Usually, yes, unemployment offices are more employee friendly and employee centered. However, I have seen many, many times, especially within the last year post-COVID, where proper documentation, and if you truthfully do go to the department to actually do an argument against what the employee is asking or saying, where they do find in favor of the employee. The employer, I'm sorry. So by having the documentation, it shows we've done our due diligence, we tried to give them the opportunity, and they still didn't get it together. So it's helpful to keep your unemployment claims down, which helps reduce your potential, tax rate. And then, of course, the Department of Labor, no one ever wants them knocking on our door. So it helps keep them at bay as well by showing you're creating proper documentation. Do follow up. Here is where one of the most balls get dropped, to be honest. Oftentimes we'll give an employee a corrective document or a corrective action or performance improvement plan, and we'll say, we're monitoring you for the next 30 days. 30 days come, 30 days go. 60 days come, 60 days go. And no one communicates with the employee ever, and no one's been really paying attention if the employee is doing better or not. So here we are, maybe 90 days down the line, and they're still not doing well, but no one has checked in with them to say, you're still not meeting metrics. Why? Or you're not meeting metrics at the 30-day timeline we gave you. We're letting you go. So list in the document that you're going to follow up at a certain date. Well, you're going to follow up in 30 days from today. Put it on your calendar. I'm going to put it on my calendar for you and I. So in 30 days, we'll check back in. Many of us get so busy and things just get out of hand and we don't realize how fast time goes. By forcing it onto our calendar, it keeps it forefront of our mind. And that way, when we get that invite the day before, reminding us, hey, you're meeting with Jan tomorrow about X, Y, and Z, we can say, oh, shoot, I need to pull the information for Jan. How is she doing? Or, you know what, Jan hasn't been doing well. Maybe I need to meet with her a little bit earlier than tomorrow. Maybe I needed to meet with her a week ago. But keeping it on the calendar and knowing it's coming up keeps everybody honest and on the same timeline and page. If you give a timeline and you don't follow up, like I said, putting it on the document but never on your calendar and you never do it, it essentially makes the corrective action void because you're not actually doing what you as the employer said you're going to do. And for you to be at the level where you're documenting something and providing it to an employee in writing and letting them know if they don't get it together that you're going to let them go, and time just keeps ticking on, how severe was the action to the organization's success? Well, if you're willing to continue to let the employee work with you and not actually address or correct the issues, it might not have been as severe. And in the eyes of an attorney or the law, it just seems like maybe you were documenting to document, which is not really going to work out in your favor. So as we've said, the best practice is to set specific performance criteria, specific timeframes, and meet. Put it on the calendar and do not delay. Now, here are some document don'ts. Do not generalize. We're going to go into the same depth for these ones. Don't generalize. Don't diagnose the why. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Don't include your mental impressions or editorial comments. Don't embellish, stretch the truth, or call something that isn't real. Avoid overly broad statements, or we'll talk what that means. And don't apologize when we're delivering it. And I'll explain why we don't want to do that. Another one of my sweet memes. All right, so don't generalize. We want to be as specific as humanly possible in these documentations without being essentially like, I guess, a super severe person who maybe has OCD. Like we don't necessarily want to be like nitpicking the little pieces of fur off of a coat, but we do need to make sure that we're documenting very thoroughly. So what is the difference, or what does that look like? Ben is late. Ben's been late 3 times this past month. Okay, great. That's not too bad. However, what would be better is Ben was late on December 2nd by 30 minutes, December 4th by 45 minutes, and December 16th by an hour. That's a lot more specific. Now we know the dates and the length of time that Ben has been late. We're not talking about 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Ben is 30 minutes plus late 3 or more times in the month. That is very specific. That is not generalized. Behavior issues are a little bit more difficult to document. So for example, some of us will say, oh, geez, I'm going to put myself in this spot. Oh, God, every time Tony comes into work, she's always in such a bad mood. She's the worst to work with. Well, are you going to write down on a piece of paper, everyone complains about you, Tony, because you're always in a bad mood and you're the worst to work with? I would tell you definitely do not do that. But what you can do is you can ask for examples of what that means. Every time Tony comes into work, she walks by people and never says hello to anybody. She sits down at her desk. She is grumbling all day. She won't answer phone calls for people who need assistance from her. She's told other employees that if they have a problem, they can take it up with her manager and to not come to her with any kind of conversation. And when she walks through the offices, she mumbles under her breath disrespectful things to other team members. That is very specific. That is very specific of what is happening. And it's not just Tony's in a bad mood. It's here is how Tony's bad mood is presenting. Here are the facts. Yes, they're behavior driven, but they're behavior driven by multiple people who can say, yeah, no, I've heard Tony say those things. Yeah, no, she's avoided phone calls from me 3 or 4 times. And it's more based on that factual data than an emotional opinion that might not necessarily have backup. Because I know I'm a parent. There's times I'll ask my kids questions. I'm like, well, what did he say that was mean to my kids when they come home? I don't know. He was just being mean. Well, what was he doing? I don't know. He just was like, just being mean to me. What does that mean to you? Sometimes we take things and we assign an emotion to it without actually slowing down and be like, okay, he was mean to you because he told you that you were ugly or fat or you had ears like a monkey. Like there's a million things, and those are things that have been said that we can address, but you have to think about the action. You can't just generalize, because I can't go to the school and say, Billy's being mean to my child. They're going to say the same thing. Well, what does that mean? Well, Billy tells my child that he has ears like a monkey. That's a little bit different. That's a little more specific. So talking about those kinds of things, and drilling into those, hone in on the behavior and the fact, not just the behavior tied to an emotion. So it talks about here, for example, the most difficult cases to defend are those in which an employee is terminated for not being a team player, not being a cultural fit, or for any other kind of cliched reason. Can you terminate somebody for not being a team player or not being a cultural fit? Absolutely. But what does that look like? What does the culture of your organization look like? Does it look like everybody volunteers on Thursdays? We close the office down and everyone volunteers. We go to the soup kitchen. It's part of our mission. It's part of our vision. This is something that we value. We give back to our community. Every Thursday, Tony refuses to come and do this. She calls out sick every Thursday, or she just calls in and she doesn't come to work. Additionally, she go on. Drill into what the performance is and how it's impacting others and the company. Provide specific examples of the problematic behavior. I think we talked about that. Don't diagnose the why. Sometimes instinctually, because it's difficult for us to have conversations about performance with employees, we want to ease them into it or make it a little easier for them. It's human nature. Just, uncomfortable conversations are not easy. No one is walking around like, God, I can't wait to have one of these today. Additionally, we work with these people regularly. So if you're the manager, the last thing you're trying to do is create a difficult working environment for yourself, because you continue to have a conversation about performance. So sometimes we try and give people an easy way out by addressing performance, but then also giving them a why they're not doing well. So what does that look like? For example, oh, Bill, you've been late 3 or 4 times in the past month. When you come in, you look a little disheveled, you're tired, you've fallen asleep at your desk. I know that you recently are going through a real difficult divorce with your wife. And I know you're in and out of court dealing with a lot of custody issues for your children. So that's probably why this is happening. But we really need you to be coming to work on time and looking a little more put together. You don't know that's why he's having those issues. And if that has nothing to do with you as technically the employer. Now, I'm not saying be heartless, don't care. I mean, people have things going on. But what I'm saying is, don't give somebody the out if there's performance-driven issues that need to be discussed. And maybe we need to have a discussion on what the new expectation may be for a short period of time for that employee if they are going through a difficult time. Because difficult times can look like a million different things. Somebody going through a medical crisis, somebody whose parent has passed away, somebody going through a divorce. There's all sorts of different things that can occur that can drive the way somebody's performance is at work. But by starting with the focus of, I know you're not doing well, but it's because I think of this, you're getting them off the hook, and you're really not saying to them, I know you're not doing well. Here's what you're not doing well. Let's get you on track. You're saying, I know you're not doing well. Why am I documenting this? No real idea. I'm going to put in here that I expect you to do something that I know you can't do because you're not doing well because of this. Why bother? Don't waste your time. So making sure we're documenting, making sure we're not talking about the why. During performance discussions, do we normally get a why? So if we said nothing to him and then he's like, I'm going through a difficult divorce and I'm dealing with custody issues, yes, we are definitely going to get people who are going to share information with us. How you manage that? A couple different ways. Maybe you're an organization that has an employee assistance program or an EAP through your short-term disability carrier or somewhere else. Offer them assistance. Did you know that we have an EAP program that you can reach out to, 100% confidential, and you can get some support that you need to help you through some of this? Provide it to them and let them go on their way. But don't continue to let them miss or not meet markers or metrics because of this, because every person deals with stress and issues in different ways. And just because Ben's going through a difficult divorce doesn't mean Sarah's not going through a difficult divorce, but she can come into work every day, compartmentalize, and get the job done. You still want to be holding people to the same standards while offering them the support that they need in order to try and be okay in their personal life. So don't, the second bullet here, understand it's entirely okay to offer employees additional assistance or benefits if they're having personal problems and they've shared that with you during the discussion of performance. Do not include references to these things in your formal documentation. Please don't put that that he's having a difficult time because of a divorce. Could Ben write that on his document? Sure, he could. Are you going to write that on the document? I certainly hope not. So keep the personal stuff outside of work off of the documentation. I have seen so many things be performance driven. It's crazy. Recently, I saw a document where it said something to the effect of, you had a lot of attendance issues in the last year, but I know it's because your daughter was in and out of the hospital and she passed away recently. Okay, you definitely should never have put that in the document. We should have addressed that very differently, and we shouldn't have addressed it at the annual review for 12 months. So paying attention to what we're writing down is very important, very, very important. Don't include your mental impressions or editorial comments. So, for example, sometimes inexperienced supervisors make mistakes and include their impressions in documentation. Usually because they're frustrated, usually because they're quick to jump, and because they are aggravated that things aren't being met when they thought that the communication was clear. So I've seen in emails or other documentation, people say things like, I thought my directions were very clear. I've explained this to you several times. Just a little bit more aggressive communication that doesn't lead to the results or really assist with the behavior kind of correction or getting the employee out the door if that's what our goal is. So don't editorialize a lot of the situation. Sometimes we want to be very long-winded. I know I've received things that are like 4 pages long that an employee has asked for me to assist them with communicating, and I can get it down usually to a page. A lot of it is emotional. A lot of it is their perception of things and not fact-based. If you're in doubt, go back to make sure things are fact-based. Do not put your own mental or emotional impressions into the document. That's not going to help. Your perception of what's happening is not driven by fact. And I know that's hard because a lot of us live in the world of perception as reality, but it isn't. So making sure that the facts are drafted, documented, and well-defined, that is what is going to help us avoid any kind of liability or avoid lawsuits or having to do settlements or huge lump sum payouts. Don't embellish, stretch the truth, or call it something it isn't. So don't overstate something and call it as you see it and nothing more. So what does that mean and look like? So I've had to deal with issues, for example, where there's been harassment investigations, and people have been participating in the investigation, and they come in, and all of a sudden I ask somebody, oh, did you see X, Y, and Z? And they're like, well, no, but I was in the kitchen the next day. And then Ben came over to me and asked if I saw it the day before, and I hadn't. So I asked him if he saw it, and he did see it. And he told me, no. So you didn't see it? Okay, great. That's all I care about. This one question. If you didn't see it, thank you for coming in. Don't let employees take your time on things that are not valuable, that are not important, and they're not going to create a result in the end. People like to be part of things, good and bad. Some people try and avoid it. Some people try and be really into it. Paying attention and just stating the truth, because as a manager, if you wrote down, Sarah spoke to Ben the following day, Ben said that he saw this, X, Y, and Z, well, how's that helpful to you? The only reason it would be helpful is if she goes, well, I'd say, oh, blah, blah, blah. Well, Ben said he didn't see it either. And if Ben had told me he didn't see it. So there could be potential rubbing here, but paying attention again is more to the character of the investigation than anything else that we're going to be documenting. So embellishment happens again. It's instinctual for us to explain away why we're not doing well for something, or using different kinds of ambiguities that we're going to talk about next. Don't be overly broad in our statements. Don't say Tony is always late. Tony is not always late. Tony has been late 5 times. What were the times and how late was she? Tony never submits her documentation or her medical record letters for her clients on time. Don't say never. Is that true? I've submitted 100 documents. Has every single document been late? Why am I still working here? So be very careful on using these kinds of languages inside the documentation, because it is not going to help. Stick with numbers, stick with information. Empty words and phrases are very difficult to try and keep strong. Insubordination is a very clear defined item. Insubordination is refusal for you to do a requested task by a manager. What was the task? Why did you refuse it? And when? Insubordination, got it. Sometimes we put other things inside of our documents that are overly broad. So we'll say, Tony can get very emotional when she's addressed on delivering documentation late. Okay, you probably shouldn't say that. Each time Tony is addressed about providing documentation late, she gets loud, she starts yelling, she slams doors, and she leaves the building and doesn't come back until the next day. Okay, those are all very specific things that you could draft, document, other people have witnessed. Very specific. Tony's emotional versus what does that mean? What is the action you're seeing that reflects the emotion? Tony gets angry. What does that look like? Tony starts throwing things around, cussing, swearing, telling people that she's going to come back to the office and threatening people. Write that down. Making sure that we're being specific on our action, not just leaving things broad. Additionally, I find sometimes people use certain language unintentionally driven towards a specific gender. So for example, a female, oftentimes I see, not always, but sometimes I'll see, we'll get the communication, Tony is overly emotional or overly sensitive. Where for a man, Tony, if I was a man, it'd be like, oh, Tony gets angry easy. Well, why am I angry easy versus overly emotional? Fun fact, anger is an emotion and it's overly sometimes. So paying attention to that. Reading your document for potential bias that you don't even necessarily intend. It's not even like an unconscious thing. It's language that we're used to and that's drilled into us. So paying attention to that. Sometimes rereading our stuff before we send it or document it. Because a creative plaintiff's counsel will find ways to use these words against you. Like I said, so Tony, I see you've written Tony up. She's overly emotional, but then you also drafted a performance document for Ben, and Ben has reflected issues for being angry when his performance has been addressed. Why was Ben not fired and Tony was? Your language, although both are equal in concept, is going to get you in trouble. Don't apologize. Again, this goes back to kind of us figuring out the why or trying to dig into the why. When we're having communications and we're documenting things, don't say you're sorry you have to do it. Even if you are, it does not ease the pain of the person that you're talking to. If you've ever been terminated or had a conversation about performance, do you truthfully feel better when the person's sitting in front of you telling you you're not doing well or they're letting you go? I'm really sorry about this. Does that give you comfort when you have to get escorted out of the building or when you have another issue that's going to affect your compensation potentially? No. It's a weird way to pacify and to make yourself feel better. It doesn't make anyone else feel better. And sometimes it can muddy the waters if we're trying to be a little bit overly sensitive to the situation, and it's not going to help the employee get better at their job or get better at the situation we're looking to work with. You're doing your job. Your job is to document issues, protect the company, and help the employee develop. If you were not intending on helping the employee develop, then just terminate each time somebody has an event. Don't bother documenting it. Documentation is trying to do two things. One, make sure there's a little bit of CYA for the company, CYA for you. And two, tell the employee, hey, buddy, pal, get it together. Otherwise, we're going to have to terminate you. And that's going to be kind of crappy on both ends. So you're doing everybody a favor by doing this. Pay attention to it. We have no problem correcting our children. We have no problem correcting our pets. But at work, we get very freaked out about having conversations about performance. It's okay to have conversations about performance. When we're focusing on them in factual basis, when we're having direct conversation, when we've written them out, it does ease the conversation for the other person because you're removing some, not necessarily all, but some of that emotional piece to it. Does it feel good to have your performance addressed? No, not always, especially if it's negative feedback. But is it going to feel good because somebody's trying to make you feel better during the process when they're letting you go? No, the result at the end of the day is you've still been let go. So who can access these documents once you've driven them, right? Once you've documented them, emails, all that kind of stuff. Employees can't access your emails, but if you've printed an email and put it in an employee file, employees can have access to their own files. They can request to see their files, absolutely. And you have to provide them either on site to witness. If they request them in writing, you can photocopy them. You can, there's like a charge, you could charge an employee to photocopy. I've never really seen anyone do it. But employees can look at their own employee files. Managers who document the performance can absolutely see it. And oftentimes, if there's more than one manager, which I encourage if there's enough people in the company, will be involved inside the conversation, whether it's the manager and the HR person, the manager and the owner, the manager and the office admin, whoever it is, to help make sure you have that secondary witness. The manager can see the documents. If you have a human resource team, they will see the documents. If your owner is the person that manages your personnel files, they obviously could see them, and then legal or government people who could subpoena. Other than that, and the goal is to really have your documentations tightened up. So if the person doesn't need to, if somebody doesn't need to know about it, then don't. If you're the size organization where the owner is not really involved in employee relations and you have an HR on-site person, it's the HR and the manager who sees the document. That's it. It doesn't need to get pushed up the chain or shared at the next leadership meeting. You want to do the best you can to keep certain things tight for a couple of reasons. You don't want to sour other people's opinion of somebody who's trying to work on their performance. And two, you want to be careful about creating a potential hostile work environment for the person that you're doing documentation and performance management with. If you work in the state of Massachusetts, if you're putting something inside of an employee file that has to do with their performance, and then the language says that could potentially impact compensation or promotion, you need to let the employee see it before it goes in there. And then the employee in Massachusetts has the right to add a document to explain themselves on the paperwork. It's a little weird. It's the way Massachusetts does it. New Hampshire does not have that requirement. So that's a unique piece about Massachusetts. Fun fact. And that is what we have for HR documentation do's and don'ts. So I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot to think about. I know there's a lot of nuances and things that kind of create a little bit of, this is okay now, maybe not later. But I'd love to, if you have any questions at this point in time, please feel free to either put them into the chat or the Q&A, and I can answer them as we go. I'll give a minute or so for you guys to be able to ask your questions. Oh, yay, got some. Do employees have to sign documents? Great question. I like to ask employees to sign documents. A couple of reasons. One, it makes it a little harder for them to claim, which I've seen. I never got that. So-and-so never talked to me about it. By law, do they have to sign it? No. If you have a section on your document that says area for employee to sign and they refuse to sign it, just make the note employee refused to sign on XYZ date and then initial it. They don't have to sign it for it to be legitimate. They don't have to sign it for it to go into their file. It doesn't make it, something that can't be found during a discoverable of a investigation. If they don't, by them not signing it, it's not telling them that, oh, well, I know that you didn't sign it, but that means it's not real and we're not going to move forward with it. So I try and tell people that, because I always get people that are like, well, I'm not going to sign this. I go, okay, that's totally fine. I said, just to let you know, even though you're refusing to sign this, it's still going in your file and it's still going to be documented as a performance issue. Your signature of this is not acceptance that you are guilty or not guilty of the action. It's just that I communicated it with you. So if they don't want to sign it, power to them, still put it in the file. Other questions? That was a good one. The documentation, people do ask about that one all the time. Okay. Well, if you have other questions, this is, again, my fantastic team. Our team has gotten bigger, as has that little baby in the middle. But if you're looking for us for additional questions or trainings, we do monthly trainings like this that are free of charge. We love to give information out to people on how to do things and reduce their risk and make their lives a little bit easier. You can follow us on any level of these social medias. And if you have questions, you can email us at the info inbox or call our hotline at the 603 number. And again, you will get this PowerPoint presentation and this recording sent to you once it becomes available to us on our Zoom cloud. And if you have questions when you receive the email, it's coming from me. So when you email back, you'll be getting me and I will answer those questions for you to the best of my ability. I appreciate everyone being on this call and having all the information and questions that they have. And I hope that this was beneficial to those who attended. Have a good rest of your day and happy Thursday.